Terence Gill refused to look at the business card being handed to him by a black woman standing in his penthouse office. He waved her off like she was delivering lunch, told his secretary to send in whoever's actually in charge, and returned to his golf swing practice without a second thought. It was the kind of casual disrespect that powerful men dispense like spare change, thoughtless, automatic, and instantly forgotten. But within 24 hours, $500 million would disappear from his accounts, his assets would be frozen, and his career would be dead. Because Evelyn Cox wasn't there to deliver papers, and she definitely wasn't someone who could be dismissed. She was the only person on earth who could authorize the wire transfer that Terence needed to survive. And she tried to introduce herself. He just couldn't be bothered to listen. Just before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The Chicago skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like a kingdom laid out for inspection. Terence Gill's penthouse office occupied the 58th floor of the Pritchard Tower, and every detail, from the hand-carved mahogany desk to the collection of crystal decanters, announced that you were in the presence of someone who mattered. Awards lined the walls. Framed magazine covers with his face. Deal tombstones from acquisitions that had made headlines. Even the air smelled expensive, like leather and aged whiskey and victory. His assistant had mentioned something about a 2 p.m. meeting. Something about the investment group. Terence hadn't paid much attention. His CFO assured him the deal was locked, the contracts were drafted, and this was just a formality, some mid-level attorney coming by to collect signatures before the big press conference tomorrow. He'd already planned his remarks. Already picked out the suit he'd wear when Bloomberg interviewed him about the merger that would cement his legacy. Evelyn Cox stepped off the elevator at 1:55 p.m., carrying a leather-bound portfolio and wearing a navy suit that spoke of quiet authority. Her appearance was immaculate, not trying to impress, but impossible to ignore. She'd reviewed Terence's file on the flight from New York. Stanford MBA. 23 years in venture capital. Known for his Midas touch and his even more legendary ego. The kind of man who measured people by their pedigree before bothering to learn their names. She approached the reception desk and introduced herself. Evelyn Cox. I have a 2 o'clock with Mr. Gill. The receptionist, a young woman who'd clearly learned to read the room, glanced at Evelyn, then at her computer screen, then back at Evelyn with barely concealed confusion. Did you say, appointment? Confirmed twice by email, Evelyn replied, her tone professional but firm. The receptionist picked up the phone, whispered something urgent, then hung up and forced a smile. Mr. Gill is finishing up another matter. If you could just wait in the lobby area, someone will be with you shortly. Evelyn didn't argue. She simply nodded and took a seat in the waiting area, not the plush executive lounge with the espresso machine and the financial news streaming on mounted screens, but the functional space near the elevator bank where courier services dropped packages and junior employees waited for approval signatures. The chairs were modern but uncomfortable. The magazines were industry publications from last quarter. A water cooler in the corner gurgled like it was laughing at everyone who sat there. She set down her portfolio and waited. Around her, the office hummed with the particular tension that wealth and power generate when they're stretched too thin. A junior associate hurried past, arms full of folders marked with yellow sticky notes. 2 men in expensive suits stood near the conference room, their voices low and urgent. One of them kept checking his phone, his jaw tight. Through a partially open door, Evelyn could see someone frantically scrolling through a spreadsheet, their face illuminated by the blue glow of panic. Something was wrong here. The office looked like success, but it felt like something else entirely. Like a mansion with foundation cracks no one wanted to acknowledge. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. Then an hour. Evelyn didn't check her watch. She simply observed. She watched the way the staff moved, rushed but aimless, like people going through motions they no longer believed in. She noticed the way Terence's office door remained closed, but laughter occasionally spilled out. Male voices. The clink of glasses. The unmistakable thwack of a golf club hitting a ball into a practice net. At 3:47 p.m., the door finally opened. Terence Gill emerged, mid-laugh, his tie loosened and his shirt sleeves rolled up. He was tall, confident, the kind of man who walked like he owned not just the room but the air inside it. Two other men followed him out, board members, from the look of their tailored suits and expensive watches. They were discussing tea times and handicaps, their voices carrying that easy camaraderie of people who'd never had to worry about being heard. Terence's secretary intercepted him. "Mr. Gill, your 2 o'clock is still here." He glanced toward the lobby, his gaze landing on Evelyn for less than a second before moving on. "Christ, I told you I don't meet with the support staff." "What firm is she from?" "Just have her leave whatever documents she brought and we'll review them." "Sir, she said she's—" "I don't care what she said." Terence's tone sharpened, loud enough that Evelyn could hear every word. "I talk to decision-makers. If her boss wants to discuss terms, they can schedule a proper meeting. Otherwise, she can leave the papers at the desk." The secretary's face flushed. She glanced toward Evelyn, apologetic, but Terence had already turned back to his guests, laughing at something one of them said. They disappeared into his office, and the door clicked shut. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't react. Her face remained perfectly composed, the kind of stillness that comes from years of practice swallowing disrespect that would choke other people. But inside her portfolio, beneath the investment memorandum and the wire transfer authorization forms, was a single document that Terence's attorneys should have read more carefully. Section 7, Paragraph C. The Leadership and Conduct Due Diligence Clause. The one that allowed her firm to withdraw funding for any behavior that demonstrated a failure of character inconsistent with our fiduciary values. She'd never used it before. Never had to. But watching Terence dismiss her without even glancing at her business card, the one with CEO, Corbett Capital Holdings embossed beneath her name, Evelyn realized something with perfect clarity. She wasn't going to use the clause to walk away from a bad deal. She was going to use it to destroy a man who thought people like her didn't matter. The question wasn't whether she would pull the funding. The question was whether Terence would realize what he'd done before it was too late. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 58th floor, a sound so polite it might have been apologizing for the intrusion. Evelyn Cox stepped into the reception area of Pritchard Capital with the kind of quiet confidence that came from owning rooms before she entered them. She'd done this 1,000 times, walked into spaces where men expected someone else, someone lesser, someone they could dismiss. The navy suit she wore wasn't armor. It didn't need to be. Her presence was enough. The receptionist glanced up from her computer screen, her professional smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. It was the same look Evelyn had seen in boardrooms from Manhattan to Hong Kong, the momentary confusion when the mental image didn't match reality. When the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar investment firm didn't look like the gray-haired white man they'd been expecting. "I'm here to see Terence Gill," Evelyn said, setting her leather portfolio on the reception desk. 2 o'clock appointment. Evelyn Cox. The receptionist's fingers paused over her keyboard. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then back to Evelyn, then to the screen again. "Did you say, appointment?" "Confirmed twice by email," Evelyn replied, her tone professional but carrying just enough weight to remind the woman that questions had limits. The receptionist picked up the phone, her voice dropping to a whisper that wasn't quite quiet enough. "There's a woman here," Says she has an appointment with Mr. Gill. A pause. No, I don't think so. She didn't mention representation. Another pause, longer this time. Okay. Yes, I'll tell her. She hung up and produced a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Mr. Gill is finishing up another matter. If you could just wait in the lobby area, someone will be with you shortly. The lobby area wasn't the executive lounge with its Italian espresso machine and leather wingback chairs. It was the functional space near the elevator bank, the kind of place where delivery people waited and junior associates stood nervously before performance reviews. The chairs were modern but deliberately uncomfortable, designed to discourage lingering. Evelyn took a seat anyway, crossing her legs and placing her portfolio beside her with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly what game was being played. A young associate hurried past, his arms full of folders marked with yellow sticky notes. He didn't acknowledge her. Neither did the two men in expensive suits who emerged from the conference room, their voices pitched low and urgent. One of them glanced in her direction, not at her face, but at the empty space she occupied, the way you might glance at furniture that had been moved without permission. 15 minutes became 30. 30 became an hour. Through it all, Evelyn remained perfectly still, her expression neutral, her posture relaxed. She watched the office move around her like water flowing past a stone. She noticed things. The way the staff moved with a particular kind of frantic energy that suggested panic disguised as productivity. The way voices dropped when people walked past Terence Gill's closed door. The occasional burst of male laughter from behind that door, followed by the unmistakable thwack of a golf club hitting a ball. At 3:47 p.m., the door finally opened. Terence Gill emerged mid-laugh, his tie loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled up in that calculated way powerful men affected when they wanted to appear approachable. Two board members followed him out, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of men who'd never had to earn their comfort in a room. They were discussing golf handicaps and weekend plans at someone's lake house. His secretary intercepted him near the reception desk. "Mr. Gill, your 2 o'clock is still here." Terence's gaze swept the lobby and landed on Evelyn for less than a second before sliding away, as if she were part of the furniture. "Christ, Angela, I told you I don't meet with the support staff." "What firm is she from?" "Just have her leave whatever documents she brought and we'll review them." "Sir, she said she's—" "I don't care what she said." Terence's voice carried across the reception area, loud enough that two junior associates froze mid-conversation. "I talk to decision-makers. If her boss wants to discuss terms, they can schedule a proper meeting. Otherwise, she can leave the papers at the desk and see herself out." He turned back to his guests without waiting for a response, his laughter resuming as if the interruption had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The door to his office closed with a soft click that sounded, to Evelyn's ears, like the ceiling of a tomb. Angela, the secretary, approached with an expression that managed to be both apologetic and helpless. "I'm so sorry, but Mr. Gill is—" "It's fine," Evelyn said quietly. She stood, gathering her portfolio with movements that were unhurried, deliberate. "I understand perfectly." And she did. She understood that Terence Gill had just made the most expensive assumption of his life. That he'd looked at her and seen someone whose time didn't matter, whose authority was negotiable, whose very presence in his office was conditional on his approval. She understood that inside her portfolio, beneath the investment memorandum and wire transfer authorization forms, was a clause that would allow her to walk away from this deal for exactly this kind of behavior. But Evelyn Cox didn't walk away from things. She dismantled them. Carefully. Completely. And always with perfect documentation. The lobby chair had a particular design philosophy, expensive enough to look impressive in photographs, uncomfortable enough to discourage anyone from staying too long. Evelyn had been sitting in it for 2 hours and 17 minutes, and she'd learned more about Pritchard Capital in that time than Terence Gill's due diligence reports had revealed in 6 months. She watched a junior analyst named Marcus, his name visible on the lanyard bouncing against his chest, make 3 trips past her seat carrying the same stack of files. On the 3rd pass, his hands were shaking. He dropped a folder near the water cooler, and papers scattered across the polished floor like leaves. 2 senior associates walked past without stopping, their conversation never pausing, their eyes never dropping to acknowledge the man scrambling to gather documents that probably represented weeks of his life. "Pathetic," one of them muttered, just loud enough. Marcus's face flushed red, but he said nothing. Just kept gathering papers with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned that invisibility was survival. Evelyn made a mental note. Added it to the growing list she was compiling in her head. A woman in her mid-30s emerged from the conference room, her makeup immaculate but unable to hide the exhaustion carved into her features. She was talking on her phone, her voice low and urgent. "I know it's your birthday, sweetie. Mommy will try to make it home before bedtime. I promise." A pause. The sound of a child crying filtered through the speaker. I know I promised last time too. But Mommy has to," her voice cracked. She turned toward the wall, her shoulders hunching inward like she was trying to disappear. When she hung up, she stood there for a long moment, her forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window. Then she straightened, smoothed her skirt, and walked back into the conference room with a smile that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. The office hummed with a particular frequency that Evelyn recognized. She'd seen it before in companies that were rotting from the inside out, the desperate energy of people working themselves to death on a sinking ship, too afraid to admit the water was rising. Everyone moved fast but accomplished little. Meetings ran long but produced nothing. Voices stayed carefully modulated, but tension leaked through every interaction like poison gas. A group of associates gathered near the coffee station, their voices just audible over the hum of the espresso machine. "Did you see the numbers from Q3?" one of them whispered. "We're down 18%. 22 if you count the Brennan deal falling through." "Christ. Does Gil know?" A bitter laugh. "Gil thinks we're geniuses. He spent yesterday afternoon practicing his swing while the SEC was on line 3. Wait, the SEC called. Twice. Angela told him it was about routine compliance. He told her to handle it and went back to his game. They scattered when a senior partner emerged from the executive wing, their conversation dissolving like roaches fleeing light. Evelyn didn't move. Didn't react. But she filed it away. SEC inquiries. Declining revenues. A CEO more interested in his golf swing than his company's survival. Through Terence's office window, visible now that the door had been left slightly ajar, she could see him leaning back in his chair, feet on his desk, phone pressed to his ear. His laughter carried into the reception area, loud and careless. "Tell Bloomberg I'll give them an exclusive. This merger is going to change everything. By Monday, I'll be the name everyone's talking about." By Monday, Evelyn thought, you'll be the name everyone's talking about for very different reasons. She checked her watch. 5:47 p.m., nearly 4 hours since her scheduled appointment. Around her, the office was beginning to empty, though several associates remained hunched over their desks, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of computer screens. One of them, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, had tears running silently down her face while she typed. No one stopped to ask if she was okay. At 6:15 p.m., Angela approached Evelyn again, her professional composure finally cracking around the edges. I'm so sorry, but Mr. Gill has had to leave for another engagement. He asked if you could schedule a follow-up meeting for next week. Perhaps with your supervisor? Evelyn stood, gathering her portfolio with the same unhurried precision she'd maintained all afternoon. That won't be necessary, she said quietly. I have everything I need. And she did. She'd watched a company cannibalizing itself while its CEO played golf. She'd seen a culture so toxic that people cried at their desks and no one noticed. She'd observed a man so convinced of his own brilliance that he couldn't see the ground crumbling beneath his feet. She'd come to authorize a $500 million investment. She was leaving with something far more valuable, confirmation that Terence Gill had built his empire on sand, and she was about to watch it sink. Terence Gill returned to the office at 6:47 p.m. with the particular swagger of a man who'd spent the afternoon being told he was brilliant. His tie was gone completely now, his shirt collar open, and he carried the satisfied glow of someone who'd closed a deal over drinks at a club where the membership waiting list was longer than most people's careers. He didn't notice Evelyn still sitting in the lobby. Not at first. She watched him stride past, watched him clap a senior associate on the shoulder with the kind of forced camaraderie that powerful men dispensed when they wanted to seem accessible. Henderson. Hell of a job on the Matsuda brief. Keep it up and you'll make partner before you're 40. Henderson beamed like he'd been granted an audience with royalty, even though Evelyn had watched him work through lunch at his desk, eating a sandwich with one hand while typing with the other, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. It was Angela who finally interrupted Terence's victory lap. Mr. Gill, the representative from the investment group, is still. Terence's expression shifted from jovial to irritated in less than a second. He turned, his gaze finally landing on Evelyn. You've been here this whole time. Evelyn stood, her movements deliberate, unhurried. Yes. Since 2 o'clock. As scheduled. Right. He waved a hand dismissively. Look, I appreciate you waiting, but I don't have time to go through paperwork tonight. Just leave whatever you need me to sign with Angela, and we'll get it processed. He was already turning away, already moving toward his office. Mr. Gill, Evelyn said, her voice level but carrying enough authority that it stopped him mid-stride. I'm not here to deliver paperwork. I'm here to discuss the terms of Corbett Capital's investment in your firm. Terence looked back at her with the kind of condescending patience usually reserved for children who didn't understand adult conversations. Then you should have brought your boss. I don't negotiate with assistants. He glanced at Angela. Who's the partner on this account? Whoever it is should know better than to send support staff to a meeting of this magnitude. I am the partner, Evelyn said quietly. She reached into her portfolio and extracted a business card, holding it out with steady fingers. Evelyn Cox. Chief Executive Officer, Corbett Capital Holdings. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, something flickered across Terence's face. Confusion. Maybe the beginning of recognition. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by skepticism that bordered on amusement. He took the card without really looking at it, his attention already drifting back to his office, to whatever celebration he'd been planning. CEO, he repeated, the word dripping with the kind of polite disbelief people use when they don't want to directly call someone a liar. Right. Look, I'm sure you're very important at your firm, but Corbett Capital is a major player. When they send someone to finalize a $500 million investment, they send decision-makers. Someone with actual authority. He glanced down at the business card in his hand, finally, actually looked at it, and his expression shifted slightly. The embossed lettering was unmistakable. The Corbett Capital logo. Her name. Her title. All of it legitimate, all of it real. But Terence had already committed to his narrative. Already decided who she was and what she represented. And powerful men didn't admit mistakes to people they decided didn't matter. "This is cute," he said, turning the card over like he was examining a child's art project. "But I've met David Corbett personally." Shook his hand at the investor summit in Aspen. "He assured me that when it came time to close this deal, he'd send his top people." He looked at Evelyn with something that might have been pity if it weren't so condescending. "No offense, but I don't think that's you." He walked toward his office, and as he passed the reception desk, he did something that Evelyn would remember with perfect clarity for the rest of her career. Something that would, in retrospect, cost him everything. He dropped her business card into Angela's trash can. Not accidentally. Not carelessly. Deliberately. With the casual finality of someone discarding junk mail. "Angela, call Corbett Capital's main office tomorrow," he said over his shoulder. "Tell them we need to reschedule with someone who actually has signing authority. And make sure they know punctuality matters. I don't have time to waste on people who can't follow protocol." The office door closed behind him with a soft click. Evelyn stood perfectly still, her portfolio clutched in both hands, her expression revealing nothing. But inside her chest, something cold and precise was crystallizing into absolute certainty. She'd given him every opportunity. Had introduced herself professionally. Had waited for hours. Had presented her credentials. Had tried, despite every insult, to conduct business with dignity and respect. And he'd thrown her card in the trash. Angela approached, her face flushed with second-hand embarrassment. "Ms. Cox, I'm so terribly sorry." "I don't know what." "It's fine," Evelyn said quietly. She reached into the trash can, retrieved her business card, and slipped it back into her portfolio. "I have everything I need." She did. She had documentation of the meeting. She had witnesses to his behavior. She had 4 hours of observations about a company rotting from the inside. And she had Section 7, Paragraph C of their investment agreement, the clause that allowed withdrawal for conduct inconsistent with fiduciary values. But more than that, she had certainty. The kind that comes from watching someone reveal exactly who they are when they think no one important is watching. Terence Gill had just ended his own career. He just didn't know it yet. The Four Seasons hotel room had the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, a desk positioned to catch the city lights, and Wi-Fi fast enough to handle simultaneous video conferences across 3 time zones. Evelyn had transformed it into a war room within 20 minutes of returning from Pritchard Capital. Her laptop screen glowed in the darkness, casting blue light across her face as she pulled up the investment memorandum. Section 7, Paragraph C stared back at her with the clinical precision of legal language designed to mean exactly what it said and nothing else. Corbett Capital Holdings reserves the right to withdraw committed funds prior to transfer in the event of conduct by principal or key personnel that demonstrates character inconsistent with the fiduciary and ethical standards outlined in Appendix D. She'd negotiated that clause herself. Terence's attorneys had barely glanced at it. Her phone buzzed. Marcus Chen, her head of legal, appeared on screen with the harried expression of someone who'd been pulled out of his daughter's piano recital. "Evelyn. Got your message. Please tell me this is urgent and not just Chicago insomnia." "Read the attachment I just sent you," Evelyn said. "All of it. Then tell me if I'm overreacting." She heard the soft tap of keys, watched Marcus's face shift from annoyed to focus to something that looked like barely suppressed fury. "He threw your business card in the trash. After keeping me waiting for 4 hours. After refusing to acknowledge my credentials. After suggesting I was impersonating an executive. Evelyn's voice remained level, but her fingers were white-knuckled around her coffee cup. I have Angela's testimony. I have timestamps from the building security logs. And I have my own documentation of every single interaction. Jesus! Marcus leaned back, rubbing his eyes. The conduct clause was meant for fraud or criminal behavior. Using it for this is exactly what it was designed for, Evelyn interrupted. Read Appendix D again. Demonstrated respect for professional standards and equitable treatment of all business partners regardless of identity. We didn't put that language in by accident, Marcus. We put it in because men like Terence Gill think respect is optional when it comes to people who don't look like them. Silence on the other end. Then, you're sure about this? $500 million. The board is going to ask questions. Let them ask. Evelyn pulled up another document, the one she'd been compiling during her 4-hour wait. While I was sitting in that lobby, I watched a junior analyst get publicly humiliated. I watched a mother miss her daughter's birthday because the culture there demands human sacrifice. I watched associates discuss SEC inquiries that Gill doesn't even know about because he's too busy practicing his golf swing. She paused. This isn't just about what he did to me. It's about what his leadership has done to that entire company. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted from skeptical to operational. I'll need depositions from anyone who witnessed the interaction. Building security footage if we can get it. And I want a full audit of their financials. If the company's as unstable as you're suggesting, we need documentation. Already requested. Evelyn forwarded 3 more files. I spoke with Jennifer in forensic accounting 20 minutes ago. She's pulling their SEC filings, cross-referencing with the financials they provided us, and flagging any discrepancies. You've been busy. I've been thorough. Evelyn stood, pacing to the window. Below, the city sprawled in electric constellations, each light representing someone's ambition, someone's late night, someone's dream. Terence Gill thinks I'm nobody. He thinks he can dismiss me and move on to the next deal. But what he doesn't understand is that I am the deal. I'm the only person on Earth who can authorize that wire transfer, and he just lost that privilege. By midnight, her team had assembled digitally from 3 different cities. Marcus on legal strategy. Jennifer from forensic accounting with a preliminary report that made Evelyn's 4-hour observation look prescient, declining revenues, creative accounting in 3 different divisions, and regulatory inquiries that hadn't been disclosed in their due diligence materials. Rebecca from PR, already drafting the statement they'd need when news broke. We invoke the clause at 9 a.m., Evelyn said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd already made the decision and was now simply implementing it. Marcus, I want the withdrawal notice delivered by courier to Terence's office. Make sure it's time-stamped. Make sure Angela signs for it. Angela? Rebecca asked. The secretary. The witness, Evelyn corrected. I want her to see exactly what happens when someone treats people like they don't matter. By 2 a.m., the documents were drafted. By 4, they were reviewed and finalized. By 6, as dawn began creeping across Lake Michigan, Evelyn was sitting at her desk with a cup of coffee and a satisfaction that felt like justice distilled into its purest form. Terence Gill would wake up this morning thinking about his press conference. About the Bloomberg interview. About the legacy he was building. He had no idea his empire was already ash. It just hadn't finished falling yet. The morning light hit the glass facade of Sterling Ventures with the kind of clean precision that made everything look possible. Evelyn stepped out of the black car at 7:15 a.m., her portfolio containing documents that would shift $500 million from one company to another before most people finished their first coffee. Sterling occupied the 42nd floor of a building that was newer, smaller, and significantly less ostentatious than Pritchard Tower. The lobby had plants instead of marble sculptures. The receptionist smiled like she meant it. "Miss Cox," she said, standing to shake Evelyn's hand. "Miss Sterling is expecting you. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine, thank you." The difference was immediate. Jarring, even. Here, Evelyn wasn't directed to a waiting area designed to make people feel small. She was led directly to a corner office where Jordan Sterling stood from behind her desk, hand extended, eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that came from someone who'd learned that unexpected meetings usually meant opportunity. "Evelyn Cox," Jordan said, her grip firm and brief. "I'll admit, when you called at 6 this morning, I thought I was still dreaming. Corbett Capital doesn't usually make house calls." "Unusual circumstances," Evelyn replied, accepting the offered chair. "I need to move quickly, and I think you'll understand why in a moment." Jordan Sterling was 34, which in the venture capital world made her simultaneously too young to be taken seriously and old enough to have earned every dismissal twice over. She'd spent 6 years at Pritchard Capital before leaving to start her own firm, a departure that Terence Gill had publicly called a waste of Stanford education and privately celebrated because he'd never liked being shown up by someone who asked inconvenient questions about ethics. "I was scheduled to finalize a $500 million investment in Pritchard Capital yesterday," Evelyn began, watching Jordan's expression shift from curious to very, very attentive. "The wire transfer was supposed to go through this morning." "It's not going to happen." Jordan leaned back slowly. "May I ask why?" "Because Terence Gill kept me waiting for 4 hours, refused to acknowledge my credentials, suggested I was impersonating an executive, and threw my business card in the trash." Evelyn's voice remained level, professional. "But also because during those 4 hours, I observed a company culture that's toxic, financials that don't match their public disclosures, and leadership that's more interested in golf than governance." For a long moment, Jordan said nothing. Then she laughed, not with humor, but with the bitter recognition of someone who'd lived through exactly what Evelyn was describing. "For hours. Christ. He made board members wait that long when he felt like it. I once watched him keep a potential investor from Tokyo waiting for 3 hours because he was in an important meeting. The important meeting was him on the phone with his decorator discussing office curtains. You left for a reason." "Several reasons." Jordan stood, moving to the window. "Terence builds empires on charisma and bullshit. It works until it doesn't. I tried to tell the board that our accounting practices were creative at best, fraudulent at worst. I tried to tell them that our culture was burning through talent faster than we could recruit. You know what Terence said?" "What?" "He said I was being emotional. That women always worry too much about feelings instead of focusing on results." Jordan turned back, her expression hard. "So I left. Started my own firm with the philosophy that you can make money without destroying people. Revolutionary concept, apparently." Evelyn opened her portfolio and slid a document across the desk. "How would you feel about proving him wrong with $500 million? Jordan picked up the document, her eye scanning quickly, professionally. Evelyn watched the moment comprehension hit, watched Jordan's hand still, her breath catch, her entire posture shift from cautious interest to electric focus. "You're serious?" "Completely. Sterling Ventures has the portfolio I was looking for. Strong fundamentals, ethical leadership, sustainable growth metrics. Everything Pritchard Capital pretended to be but isn't." Evelyn leaned forward. The capital was always meant for someone who understood that how you build matters as much as what you build. Terence just assumed it was his. He was wrong. He's going to lose his mind. Jordan's voice carried something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was definitely adjacent to it. He's going to lose more than that. The withdrawal triggers margin calls on 3 of his major positions. My forensic accountant found discrepancies in his SEC filings. And when word gets out that Corbett Capital pulled $500 million because of conduct concerns, every other investor is going to start asking questions he can't answer. Jordan set down the document carefully, like it might explode. When does this become official? My courier delivers the withdrawal notice to Pritchard Capital at 9 a.m. Our investment committee meets at noon to approve the sterling allocation. If you're interested, I can have term sheets on your desk by 2. If I'm interested. Jordan laughed, and this time it was genuine. Evelyn, I've spent 3 years building this firm on principles that everyone said would make me irrelevant. Terence told people I'd be bankrupt within 18 months. He's been waiting for me to fail so he could call it proof that ethics and profit don't mix. Then let's prove him wrong. Evelyn stood, extending her hand. Not because of revenge, but because you're the better investment. You always were. He just couldn't see it. Jordan's handshake was firm, certain. When he finds out. He already lost, Evelyn said quietly. He just doesn't know it yet. The private dining room at Gibson Steakhouse had the kind of quiet opulence that came from old money and older whiskey. Terence Gill stood at the head of the table, a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25 in his hand, his smile carrying the satisfied weight of a man who believed he'd already won. "Gentlemen," he said, and the word hung in the air with casual exclusion, "today marks the beginning of a new era for Pritchard Capital." Around the table, 8 board members, 7 men in expensive suits and 1 woman who'd learned to laugh at the right jokes, raised their glasses in anticipation. The room smelled like aged beef and cigar smoke, though smoking wasn't technically allowed. Rules had a way of bending around men like Terence. $500 million, Terence continued, letting the number sit there like a trophy. Corbett Capital. One of the most selective investment firms in the world. And they chose us. He paused for effect, his smile widening. They chose me. Richard Brennan, the oldest board member and the one who'd helped Terence secure his first major acquisition, chuckled into his scotch. I heard you had them waiting yesterday. Very power play of you. Not a power play, Terence said smoothly. A reminder. These investment groups send their junior people to test the waters, see if you'll roll over for anyone with a checkbook. You have to establish dominance early. Let them know who's running the show. So you made them wait. This from David Chen, the CFO, whose voice carried a note of concern that everyone else seemed determined to ignore. For hours, Terence said proudly. Some assistant or paralegal type. Kept insisting she was there to discuss terms. I told Angela to tell her to leave the papers and we'd review them with the actual decision makers. He took a long sip of whiskey. You should have seen her face when I explained how real business gets done. The table laughed, though David's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He'd seen the preliminary numbers that morning. The ones that showed Q3 revenues down 22%. The ones that revealed the SEC had called twice in the past week. The ones that suggested $500 million wasn't a celebration, it was a life preserver. The wire transfer should hit our accounts first thing tomorrow, Terence continued, moving around the table like a general reviewing his troops. Which means by Monday, we'll be making acquisitions that will put us in a completely different league. Henderson, that aerospace startup you've been tracking, we're buying it. Chen, accelerate the expansion into the European markets. And Richard, I want you to start identifying the next 3 companies we're going to absorb. Terence, David interrupted carefully. Shouldn't we wait until the funds actually clear before? Before what? Before we act like winners. Terence's tone sharpened just enough to remind everyone in the room who signed their paychecks. This is why you handle numbers and I handle vision, David. Money follows confidence. Corbett Capital invested in us because they recognize that Pritchard Capital isn't just another firm, we're the future of venture capital. He raised his glass higher. To the future. To $500 million. And to everyone who doubted we could get here. The glasses clinked with the particular music of crystal uncertainty. Terence drained his whiskey and signaled for another round, already moving into stories about the Bloomberg interview he'd scheduled for next week, the magazine covers he was negotiating, the speaking tour his publicist was arranging. David Chen checked his phone under the table. No notifications. No wire transfer confirmation. No email from Corbett Capital. Just the usual cascade of increasingly urgent messages from department heads asking about budget approvals that were on hold until the investment cleared. He looked up at Terence, who was now demonstrating his golf swing to appreciative laughter, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The kind of feeling you get when you're standing in a building and you hear the first crack of a foundation giving way. Terence, he tried again. Did Corbett Capital confirm the transfer timeline? Because I'm not seeing any. David, relax. Terence clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to rattle teeth. Everything is locked in. Contracts are signed. This is happening. He lowered his voice to something that was almost conspiratorial. I know you've been nervous about the quarterly numbers. I know the SEC has been asking their tedious questions. But after tomorrow, none of that matters. We'll have the capital to cover any shortfalls, silence any concerns, and prove to everyone that Pritchard Capital is untouchable. David wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that the woman who'd waited in their lobby for 4 hours was really just some low-level assistant. Wanted to believe that a firm like Corbett Capital would wire $500 million based on a handshake and a scheduled press conference. But he'd been in finance long enough to know that certainty was usually just arrogance wearing an expensive suit. To tomorrow, Terence said, raising his glass one more time. The table echoed him. To tomorrow. Outside, Chicago glittered with Friday night promise. Inside, 8 men and 1 woman drank to a future that was already ash. They just didn't know it yet. David checked his phone again. Still nothing. The first crack had already formed. It just hadn't finished spreading. David Chen arrived at the office at 6:47 a.m., which was early even by his standards. He'd been awake since 4, staring at his phone, refreshing his email, checking the bank portal every 15 minutes like a man waiting for test results that would determine whether he lived or died. The wire transfer should have hit overnight. That's what Terence had said. That's what the timeline suggested. $500 million didn't just appear. There were protocols, verifications, international banking procedures that took hours even when everything went smoothly. But David had been in finance long enough to know the difference between should have and did. He logged into the primary account, his coffee untouched on his desk, his hand hovering over the keyboard like he could will the numbers into existence through sheer desperation. Balance, $47,293,441.18. The same number that had been there yesterday. And the day before. And the day before that. His stomach dropped through the floor. He checked the transaction history. Nothing. No pending transfers. No holds. No notes from Corbett Capital's bank. Just the terrifying silence of money that wasn't coming. David's hands were shaking as he pulled up his email. There had to be a message. An explanation. Maybe a delay. International transfers sometimes took longer than expected. Maybe there was paperwork that needed additional signatures. Maybe. His inbox refreshed, and a new message appeared at the top. From F. Marcus Chen, General Counsel, Corbett Capital Holdings. Subject, Notice of Investment Withdrawal, Pritchard Capital. Time, 9:03 a.m. David's vision tunneled. He clicked on the email with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. The letter was formal, clinical, devastating. Words like conduct inconsistent with fiduciary standards and immaterial concerns regarding leadership character and effective immediately arranged themselves into sentences that read like an execution order. Pursuant to Section 7, Paragraph C of the investment agreement dated August 15, 2024, Corbett Capital Holdings hereby withdraws its committed investment of $500 million in Pritchard Capital, effective immediately. This withdrawal is based on documented conduct by Principal Terence Gill that demonstrates character inconsistent with the fiduciary and ethical standards outlined in Appendix D of said agreement. All parties are hereby notified that no funds will be transferred and all obligations under the investment agreement are terminated. David read it 3 times. Then 4. The words didn't change. The reality didn't shift. $500 million, the lifeline they'd been counting on, the salvation that was supposed to solve everything, wasn't coming. Had never been coming. Not since yesterday at 6:47 p.m., when Terence had apparently thrown someone's business card in the trash. David's phone buzzed. A text from Richard Brennan, "Wire hit yet? Need to know before I commit to the aerospace acquisition." Then another from the head of European expansion, confirming we're greenlit for the Frankfurt office lease. And another, "When can we expect budget approvals?" They were all waiting. All assuming. All operating under the certainty that Terence had sold them last night over whiskey and steaks. David looked at his computer screen, at the email that was about to detonate their entire company, and realized he had to tell Terence. Had to walk into that office and explain that everything, the celebration, the expansion plans, the Bloomberg interview, the future they'd toasted, was gone. His phone rang. Terence's private line. David answered with a voice that sounded like it was coming from underwater. "Terence. Chen. Tell me we're swimming in Corbett Capital money this morning. I've got the PR team waiting to send out the press release." David closed his eyes. "Terence, we need to talk. In person. Right now. Can't it wait? I'm about to head into a breakfast meeting with. The money isn't coming." Silence. Long enough that David thought the call had dropped. Then, what? The wire transfer. It's not in our account. It's never going to be in our account. David pulled up the email on his screen, his hands shaking so badly he could barely control the mouse. Corbett Capital withdrew their investment. 9 a.m. this morning. It's official. That's not possible. Terence's voice had lost all its smoothness, all its confidence. The deal was done. Contracts were signed. They can't just. They can. They did. Section 7, Paragraph C. The Conduct Clause. David took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. "Terence, they're citing your behavior. Yesterday. The woman you kept waiting. The one you told to leave papers at the desk." He paused. That was Evelyn Cox, CEO of Corbett Capital. The silence that followed was absolute. "That's not she couldn't have been. Terence's voice had become something David had never heard before. Something that sounded like a man watching the ground open beneath his feet. She was an assistant. She had to be. Corbett would have sent someone. They did send someone. They sent the only person who could authorize the transfer. David pulled up Evelyn's credentials on his screen, though he didn't know why. Maybe because he needed to see it himself. To confirm that this was real. Stanford Law. Harvard MBA. CEO for 6 years. She handles all major investments personally. I want her on the phone. Right now. I'll explain. I'll apologize. Terence. David's voice cracked. The margin calls. The ones I told you about last month. The ones secured against this investment. He pulled up the portfolio, watched the numbers cascade down his screen like dominoes falling. They execute at market open. In 13 minutes. The line went dead. David sat alone in his office, watching the sun rise over Chicago, and wondered how long it would take for a 58-story empire to finish collapsing. The Sterling Ventures conference room had been transformed overnight into something that looked less like an office and more like the future being born in real time. Cameras from Bloomberg, CNBC, and the Wall Street Journal lined the back wall. The term sheets were arranged on the mahogany table like artifacts in a museum, each page representing a shift in power that would ripple through the venture capital world for years. Jordan Sterling stood near the window, her navy suit pressed to perfection, her hand steady as she reviewed the final documents. Across the table, Evelyn Cox sat with the quiet composure of someone who'd already won and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. At 10:47 a.m., Evelyn's phone buzzed for the 16th time in an hour. She glanced at the screen without touching it. Terence Gill. Again. She let it go to voicemail. Again. His persistent, Jordan observed, signing the last page of the investment memorandum. His desperate. Evelyn picked up her pen, her signature flowing across the document with the finality of a judge's gavel. His CFO would have told him about the margin calls by now. He knows exactly how much trouble he's in. The cameras clicked to life as the press conference began. Jordan spoke first, her voice carrying the particular electricity that came from someone who'd spent years being underestimated and was now about to prove every doubter wrong. 3 years ago, I left Pritchard Capital because I believed there was a better way to build companies. A way that didn't require sacrificing people for profit. A way that recognized that how you lead matters as much as what you achieve. She paused, looking directly into the cameras. Today, Corbett Capital Holdings has invested $500 million in that vision. In Sterling Ventures. In the future we're building together. The reporters leaned forward, pens moving, cameras adjusting. This was the story, the young female CEO who'd walked away from a titan and built her own empire. The investment firm that bet on ethics over ego. But it was Evelyn's statement that would make headlines. I'd like to address something directly, Evelyn said, her voice level but carrying enough edge to make everyone in the room go perfectly still. Yesterday, I sat in the lobby of Pritchard Capital for 4 hours waiting for a meeting that never happened. I was told to leave paperwork at the desk. I was dismissed as support staff. My credentials were questioned. My business card was thrown in the trash. The camera swung toward her, the reporters suddenly very, very attentive. This investment was always meant for a leader who understood that respect isn't optional. That competence isn't determined by appearance. That building a successful company requires more than charisma and a golf handicap. Evelyn's gaze remained steady, looking directly into the lens. Terence Gill assumed the money was his. He assumed that treating people with contempt had no consequences. He was wrong on both counts. Her phone buzzed again. She picked it up this time, held it up so the cameras could see the caller ID, Terence Gill. Then she declined the call and set the phone face down on the table. Section 7, Paragraph C of our standard investment agreement includes a conduct clause, Evelyn continued. It allows us to withdraw committed funds when leadership demonstrates character inconsistent with our fiduciary values. Yesterday, Mr. Gill demonstrated exactly the kind of character we cannot and will not support with Corbett Capital's resources. A reporter from Bloomberg raised her hand. Ms. Cox, are you saying you pulled $500 million because of a single incident? I'm saying I pulled $500 million because in 4 hours, I watched a company destroy itself from the inside while its CEO practiced golf swings. I watched junior employees be humiliated. I watched a mother miss her daughter's birthday. I watched a culture so toxic that people cried at their desks and no one noticed. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. The dismissal was simply the moment I stopped pretending any of that was acceptable. Another reporter, what do you say to critics who might claim this was an overreaction? I'd say that consequences aren't overreactions. They're accountability. Evelyn's voice remained perfectly calm. And I'd say that Sterling Ventures represents everything Pritchard Capital could have been if it had been led by someone who understood that power without integrity is just tyranny with better furniture. Jordan raised her glass of water in a quiet toast. To building something better. Evelyn returned the gesture. To making sure the right people have the resources to do it. The press conference concluded at 11:23 a.m. By 11:30, the footage was being cut and edited for the afternoon news cycle. By noon, it would be trending on financial Twitter. By 2 p.m., every major outlet would be running the story. But the real story, the one that would matter most, was happening across town in a penthouse office where Terence Gill was watching his entire empire collapse in real time, finally understanding that the woman he'd dismissed wasn't delivering papers. She was delivering justice. And she didn't need his permission to do it. The offices of Pritchard Capital looked the same as they had 3 months ago, same mahogany desks, same floor-to-ceiling windows, same crystal decanters gathering dust on shelves that no one bothered to polish anymore. But the building was a corpse now, and everyone who walked through it could feel the decay. Terence Gill sat in what used to be a junior associate's office on the 32nd floor. Not the penthouse. Not the corner suite with the view of the Chicago skyline laid out like a kingdom. Those had been surrendered to creditors in week 2, along with the art collection, the vintage furniture, and the golf clubs that had cost more than most people's cars. The margin calls had executed at 9:13 a.m. on that Friday morning, cascading through his portfolio like dominoes engineered for maximum destruction. By noon, 3 major positions were liquidated at catastrophic losses. By close of business, the SEC had announced a formal investigation into the accounting discrepancies that Evelyn Cox's forensic team had flagged. By Monday, 6 board members had resigned. By Wednesday, the firm's credit lines were frozen. It took exactly 47 days for an empire built over 23 years to become rubble. David Chen had been one of the first to leave, taking a position at a firm in San Francisco that actually valued people who asked inconvenient questions. Henderson went to a boutique investment group in Boston. Marcus, the junior analyst who dropped his files, found work at Sterling Ventures, where Jordan Sterling had apparently made it a point to hire people who'd survived Pritchard Capital's toxic culture. Angela, the secretary who'd witnessed everything, had given her deposition to Corbett Capital's legal team with the kind of precision that came from years of watching powerful men assume she was invisible. Her testimony had been devastating. Clinical. Unimpeachable. Terence stared at the laptop screen in front of him, not his laptop, the firm's, one of the ones that hadn't been seized yet. He was reading the Wall Street Journal article for the 5th time, though he'd memorized every word by the second. The Fall of Pritchard Capital, How Arrogance Killed a $500 million Deal. The article detailed everything. The 4-hour wait. The dismissal. The business card in the trash. But it also went deeper, pulling on threads that Terence hadn't even known were visible. The toxic culture. The accounting irregularities. The SEC inquiries he'd ignored. The employees who'd burned out and broken down while he practiced golf swings and planned press conferences that would never happen. Evelyn Cox had given exactly one interview, to Bloomberg, and she'd been characteristically precise. This wasn't about revenge, she'd said, her face calm on the screen. This was about recognizing that how a leader treats people in private reveals everything about how they'll handle power in public. Mr. Gill showed me exactly who he was. I simply acted on that information. When asked if she felt any regret about destroying his career, she'd paused for exactly 2 seconds. No, she'd said. But I hope he learned something from it. Terence closed the laptop. His hands were shaking, had been shaking for weeks now, ever since the morning David had told him the money wasn't coming. Ever since he'd realized that the woman he'd dismissed, the business card he'd thrown away, the 4 hours he'd considered irrelevant, had been the only thing standing between him and total collapse. He'd tried calling her 17 times that first day alone. She'd never answered. Never returned a voicemail. Never acknowledged his existence except through her lawyers, who communicated in the kind of formal language that made it clear there would be no negotiation, no second chances, no redemption arc. The door opened. Richard Brennan, the only board member who'd stayed, stood in the doorway looking like he'd aged a decade in 2 months. Terence. The bankruptcy attorneys are here. Terence nodded without speaking. Bankruptcy. The word tasted like ash. Before we go in, Richard said quietly, I need to ask. That woman. Evelyn Cox. Did you really not know who she was? Terence thought about lying. Thought about claiming he'd been set up, misled, that anyone would have made the same mistake. But the truth was simpler and so much worse. I knew her title, he said finally. It was on her business card. CEO. Corbett Capital Holdings. I saw it when I threw it away. Then why? Because I didn't believe her? Terence's voice cracked. I looked at her and decided she couldn't be who she said she was. That someone that important would look different. Would be different. He laughed, and it sounded like something breaking. I had every piece of information I needed. I just couldn't see past my own assumptions. Richard was quiet for a long moment. The press is calling it the most expensive act of discrimination in venture capital history. It wasn't discrimination, Terence said reflexively, then stopped. Because what else could you call it? Looking at someone's credentials and deciding they must be lying because they didn't match the image in your head? Treating competence as something that came with a specific appearance, a specific background, a specific set of assumptions about who deserved respect and who didn't. It was pride, Terence said quietly. Just pride. The stupidest, most expensive pride in history. Richard left without another word. Terence sat alone in the small office that used to belong to someone else, in a building that would soon belong to creditors, surrounded by the ruins of an empire he'd built on the assumption that he was always the smartest person in the room. He'd been wrong about that too. Evelyn Cox had given him every opportunity. Had waited for hours. Had presented her credentials. Had tried to conduct business with dignity despite every insult. And he'd thrown her card in the trash because his pride couldn't accept that power might look different than he expected. Outside the window, Chicago glittered in the afternoon sun, indifferent to his collapse. Somewhere across town, Jordan Sterling was probably signing another deal, building the future with capital that should have been his. And Evelyn Cox was moving on to the next investment, the next opportunity, the next leader who understood that respect wasn't optional. Terence had owned penthouses and golf clubs and magazine covers. But in the end, the only thing he truly possessed was pride. And it had cost him everything. The end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.